All right, so I definitely wanted to just kind of touch on the back leg tension. I know it's something, me personally, I kind of struggled to understand for years. Didn't really understand how's the lower half supposed to work. You hear remove slack, you hear create tension, you hear hinge, you hear all these different terms. But I'm sure there's a lot of players out there who are just kind of struggling to make sense of all the different drills they're seeing, all the different terminology they're seeing. So specifically wanted to discuss with you guys, you've thrown upper 90s, you've thrown upper 90s, I've thrown upper 90s, but we have done so in a very different way. So like Marcilli, obviously a guy with very, very little hip internal rotation. And some guys think, well, okay, that's just like, I have, no possible chance of ever throwing hard because I just wasn't blessed with amazing mobility. But you're clearly an example of that's not the case. You're somewhere in between, decent IR, decent ER, but not really exceptional in either direction. And then I have terrible ER and really good IR. And so, kind of all different sides of the spectrum. I thought it'd be cool to first we kind of break down what exactly is back hip tension and kind of the purpose of that in the throw. Then kind of discuss the feel of, how does it feel for you back leg wise? What are you thinking about? What are your cues? How have you figured that out over your career? Same for you, same for me. And then kind of give people, one or two simple drills or cues or tips that might help a player from your situation, my situation, and then kind of let the conversation go wherever it takes us. So I guess like first question is, can we kind of decode or break down back hip tension? Like, I guess Scott, first with you, what do you think of when you think back leg tension? How does that fit into this idea of hinge, removing slack? Like, what exactly is going on there?
Yeah, I really like kind of all of those terms at different times, so to speak. Whether it's hinge or your best loaded position. Any of those kind of things are interchangeable to some degree to me. I think in my experience, like you mentioned, I am kind of in between, in terms of anatomical bias. So I've tried like several different methods to try to figure out the best kind of way for me. Uh, and ultimately, it kind of struck me as I was just like, I was watching like some of my best throws of all time, like just with no context, like whether that was pull downs or a pitch or whatever. And I was just watching and it kept striking me that like the position that I was finding was like a kind of an IR bias or, something that I wasn't expecting because I knew that I had, I guess, more external rotation and I had usually been trying to kind of sit out or, force vertical shin. And, for some reason that just like wasn't meshing in my brain. And so I started thinking about just like, if I want to produce maximum power, that way, I have to produce maximum tension or, rotational load into my hip. And so that's kind of, I started chasing that feeling and ultimately that kind of brought me back more to the IR style, even though my hip anatomy might not like directly say that.
So big picture, like zooming out before we get into like the specifics of ER versus IR, back leg tension is simply loading the spring to be able to have something to unload.
That's how I think of it,
Right.
for sure.
The kind of the way I'll think of it, like you ever hear the term, you can't shoot a cannon out of a canoe. It's this idea of if you have any sort of instability in the system, in the ground contact point from the shoe, from the foot, from the ground, up through the entire back hip, that entire complex. If there's any instability there, you're not going to have anything stable to rotate your pelvis against. But if you can
Absolutely.
remove slack, which is really, in my mind, removing slack is the same thing as creating tension. It's literally just two sides of looking at that idea.
Yes.
But you think about it, if you have shoes with no traction, what do you have? You have an instability with the ground. If you have an ankle that's not stable, what do you have? You have an instability in that chain. Knee that's not stable, or maybe you banged up your knee, now there's an instability point. If you can't pull out that tension from the back hip, now there's an instability point at that joint.
Mm-hmm.
So I think of it as like at every single joint through this entire back hip complex down to the ground, you're creating tension, you're sinking that up to the pelvis. Now that you've loaded that, you have to be able to move down the mound while holding that tension, but now you have something to actually unload against, something stable. If this is just loosey-goosey out here, it's like there's nothing to rotate against, and that's when you see guys, upper half takes over, their arm starts to push, start to yank, pull off really hard, because there's nothing to actually unload from the lower half, because they haven't loaded into the lower half.
And I think that's just a common thing that I see with a lot of athletes, they're sending me videos of them doing a med ball throw or a drill, and the first thing I notice is their foot, slipping out on the turf or whatever it is. It's like, no matter what you're trying to do, like you said, first you have to have a stable base to push into the ground against or into the rubber against. If there's some sort of give there, that's an instant leak, automatic compensation kind of up the chain. So
I mean, that's why the first thing I say to anyone is like, all right, if you're just going to stand there and you're going to try and get your leg in the most powerful position, like, how are you going to do it? You're not going to do it just by going like this. You're not going to do it just by going like this. Like, it has to be a move back and turn to create that tension, power, position. And if you can't do it just by sitting here and creating it on your own, how are you going to do it when you're moving full speed?
Three-dimensional.
Yes, three-dimensional
That's what I
move
think
right there.
Yeah. And that's the idea we talked about before of a rotational hinge.
Yes.
Like a hinge, a deadlift hinge is just straight back, but
Yeah.
there's not necessarily that internal rotational tension. When you teach that, do you actually feel like a coil or a stretch when you get to that position? What does that feel like for someone who doesn't even know where to start and they're like, I have no idea if I'm creating tension or not?
I think like what Matt just said about, three-dimensional load, like that is totally what I think of too. And to me, that means there has to be some combination of, up and down one dimension, backward, forward, kind of weight shift 2-dimension, rotational 3-dimension. So when I hit all three of those, like that's my best position or kind of the best pattern that I'm shooting for. If I'm only up and down and rotational, like that's going to affect my delivery out there. So 3-dimensional, I think, is a really big key for a lot of guys.
And I think fundamentally there's 2 points there. One is that what exactly are you, when you say creating tension, like what is exactly happening? My thought is that you have basically a fixed point to the ground, stable foot position, and you're literally winding the fascia and you're winding the deep hip rotators. You get like this, if you exaggerate and you get into some of these positions, you can literally feel like a winding up inside the hip socket itself. So there's a fascial winding, there's a winding of the different deep hip rotator muscles. But then the second point there is that you mentioned like it's a 3-dimensional winding. The exact degree of hip flexion, the exact amount of knee bend, the exact amount of coil, that's going to be completely dependent on your range of motion, your hip anatomy. So that might be interesting to talk about too. It's one of the tests that I'll use is just like a seated hip IR test, and just based on that, you almost get some indication of like where their shin angle might be, because you'll have someone like Matt, like, so you can imagine just sitting on a box and doing this, but this is, my good hip, my other hip's not so great right now, but you can see I have, easily 45 degrees, like a good amount of hip IR. We look at Matt, we look at my, or my bad hip, no IR there. We look at Scott, he's somewhere in between 15, 20 degrees. And so that's a great just rule of thumb, or like very quick.
It's a good starting point.
Yeah, it's a starting point to have some idea of like, okay, is this somebody with really good ER, really good IR? And that might roughly, in a lot of cases, mirror the ideal shin angle they're gonna have on the mound. So you think about someone who can easily get into that position, on the mound, they're gonna be able to get into a much more lateral loading position versus you, like you're fully wound, you demonstrated that, but you're still in more of a vertical shin.
Yeah.
But I think for me, the thing that clicked when we had this discussion, I think 2 months ago, is I've always known how to relate to guys that have a lot of hip IR that move like me. I can project what I'm feeling on them and have, reasonable certainty, but I never quite knew how to communicate with guys like you, where it's like, I have completely different ends of the spectrum. Like,
Tough to coach something you've never done.
so for me, the question was like, for guys like you see that on video, like a Verlander, they're gonna have more of a vertical shin typically. They're gonna clear the lead leg a little bit earlier. That's obvious, but what are they feeling internally and how do they get to those positions? That's the important piece that I could never make the leap to until we discussed that, until Scott was like really experimenting with it and saw, hey, despite not having great IR, still trying to load into IR was his unlock. And then talking to you, like you still are coiling and creating tension.
Yep.
It's just you don't have much range to like coil into, so it still ends up looking like a vertical shin.
Yeah.
But
Well,
there's a difference between that and like trying to hold the knees out this way on the outside of the foot.
yeah. I mean, I've definitely done both, to where I'm trying to open up the foot, I'm trying to hold this back and get in this like pretty hinge position. I remember like that's when I was working with Zombro, and he was like, "Yeah, it looks good, but like, can you feel anything?" I was like, "Well, no, but it looks good on camera." or like, is it really doing anything? So honestly, the major unlock for me was, you talk about like winding that leg up, like the wide stance wind ups that Cone gives, to where you start wide and you start trying to get here, wind that leg up, and then drop. Like for me, it was just like, okay, I'm trying to take my ankle, my knee, my hip, I'm trying to turn it up to where my glute is turned on by max peak leg lift, and then boom, I drop. And for me, like that was my delivery. Like I would start here, load, boom, and then drop. And it worked on the drift, worked on like actually creating that tension. All I had to do from there was just drop and go. There was no more thinking about unloading because I loaded it perfectly. So that's kind of like my whole, I talk to guys, if you can load it perfectly, more times than not, you're gonna unload perfectly. So if I have like max tension and I wound this up, boom, I'm gonna let gravity take over. And honestly, for me, it was a light bulb moment, and it like fixed everything. So,
And give us a relative idea of like velocity wise, like what's the differential between you when you were just like trying to hold the knee back and when you figured that out? Was it 2-3 mile an hour bump? What was that?
So for me, I was always a big drift guy. I could always go forward, but I only thought about sitting with my butt going behind me. So super like vertical shin, not really, I would say tension, but pretty like sit back. So for me, like trying to same drift while going forward, but drifting and loading now at the same time, to where I was going forward and turning this on. Now they gave me like a feeling of I knew if I didn't create that tension by peak leg lift, it was gonna be bad. I was either gonna spray it or it was gonna be slow. So it really took me from like a 90-93 guy with, good drift, good looking back leg, to the 94-97, to where not doing the exact same thing, but just turning and creating tension in the peak leg lift, and it was 4-7 automatically. And I just, again, someone with not a lot of IR, what I did was I had to create, room elsewhere. So ankle, tibia, adductors, soft tissue, glute, TFL, the stuff that helped me internally rotate, but not actually improving any hip internal rotation. So I was able to find room in other areas that would help my hip IR,
Yeah.
but I didn't actually improve hip IR.
How do you know if you're over coiling, right? Because you're describing that you kind of are starting to create a little bit more of a coil versus just purely being, back to front. You're adding a little bit of a coil. But how do you know when it's too much? Is it when you see the foot start to slip out on you, when you see the knee start to slip out on you? Did you experiment with too much coil and you're like, that's definitely excessive?
For me, it was being able to see the target. So when I would coil too much, I'd get right here. And I'm not a guy to where I could be very rotational in this move, just because I didn't have the access rotation, again, upper body or lower body, to pull stuff out. So it had to be pretty linear. So I knew, if I turned too much, I was gonna start missing that way, and my direction was gonna be completely off. I was either gonna land slightly closed, my pelvis couldn't get open, or I was just gonna fly open. So for me, if I could still see the target and create that move and get everything going this way, I knew I was spot on.
So there was a sweet spot where you could still see the target, you could still be roughly even with the rubber with your foot, and you could still get a coil and create max tension. And so for me, I can relate to that in the sense of like creating max tension at peak leg lift, but because I have so much more IR, for me, like when I would keep my foot even with a rubber, right, for me to create tension, it's almost like a Josh Hader move. Like I would have to be way back here. And so when I would do that, now I couldn't pick up the target to the same extent. Whereas like your max tension might be like here, you can still easily be on the target. For me, if it's back there. So what I almost figured out for myself was turning the back foot in 10-15 degrees. And that essentially is taking out 10 to 15 degrees of that slack in the back hip. So now, the point of max tension, max coil for me was, 15 degrees less of coil because of just tweaking that back foot position.
And that's where the opposite for me was. I would start neutral and let my coil kick my foot open a little bit to open up a little bit more range for my hip to get into ER. Now, like, you have some people who are setting up with their feet like this, just trying to open up more ER, and I tried that. I mean, I remember pitching an indie ball, my toes were legit pointing second base, and I was like, thinking now, like, what was I doing? But like for me, like when I would coil, my foot would slip into a slightly like heel would come out position. And I knew like, okay, I'm gonna athletically get into that position compared to like pre-starting it. And my body would naturally get there. I'm ready to rock and roll.
I think I think you guys are kind of both touching on the same idea that, spurred a lot of change in my delivery about, like when do I hit the tension If I'm, if my foot's turned too far out, like preset, like you said, like I'm gonna have to go way back here to find tension and totally lose sight of everything that I'm trying to direct my energy towards, in the target or whatever. So cheating the coil, like that's I love that kind of concept of if I feel like I have to coil too much, where now I'm getting over rotational on the way back, I can just turn my foot in, or I took that I went from foot out to foot neutral, and then I went from foot neutral to hook the rubber to just continue to push that further where I could see the target a lot better and create that that tension a lot earlier, where it also just simplified my delivery. Something I had always struggled with, especially in the stretch, was how do I find my same, my sit
Right.
and rotate kind of feeling with the time constraint of having a runner on base.
Can you show us how you hook the rubber? Because I know that's something that you've now played with a good proportion of your guys with. Obviously, that's throwback to Sandy Koufax, popularized that. Then he taught that to Pedro Martinez.
Yep.
Clayton Kershaw will do that at times. Take us through how you do that for those who aren't familiar with hooking the rubber, and how if it's as a specific athlete that would benefit from that, or who you might stay away from that cue with.
Yeah. So hooking the rubber to me is just getting your foot kind of wedged up against the side of it like this. I think some guys will do slightly different positions with that. Maybe toe slightly out or toe slightly in. Depending on their kind of style. But to me, especially on an indoor mound like this, there is kind of a technique to it that you really need to get almost the inside of your foot up against the edge of the rubber, right? It creates that wedge so that now I have a stable base to push against. I see a lot of guys who just try to get an edge of their foot on, and as soon as they try to turn into it, just slips out. So on something like this, really getting the inside, arch of your foot, pressing into that.
Almost like you're setting that shin angle.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Right. If I did my, test here, right, I kind of am presetting that.
Right.
And that was the thing of, okay, I need to find my best loaded position to throw my best pitch out there. Like you said, I need to find my best position somewhere here at the bottom, of my kind of descent.
So essentially, just to summarize, there's a bunch of different ways to create tension.
Mm-hmm.
You can create tension from up top.
Mm-hmm.
That's the pelvic-driven IR. That's tension up top. You can create tension from the bottom by turning your foot in, or by hooking the rubber, by creating a more positive shin angle.
Yep.
If you create tension from the bottom, then you have to counter rotate less, and you can stay on target a little bit better.
Yeah.
But there can be a combination of both examples.
And I think, part of the thing that really, I guess, solidified it in my mind was aren't my mechanics just there to get me into my best loaded position and out of my best loaded position? What's the point of mechanics besides that? And when I thought about it that way, I was like, wow, I've been over mechanizing all these parts, saying, oh, this is the right technique, that's the right technique, when the simplest way to your best loaded position, that's your best mechanics. And so that totally just kind of blew my mind and simplified everything, where I used to be trying to get all this momentum and sit into it and turn and boom, 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 boom. And the whole kind of concept simplified into that, and I can throw harder, more accurately with a 1-2 delivery, when that's never something that
Right.
I was capable of before.
I think we've all kind of had similar experiences, in the sense that if you can have a very simple way to load and create tension, the rest of the throw just kind of unloads from that point.
Mm-hmm.
When Marceli was talking, I was thinking back to my own experience, and very much, and I did have more quote unquote moving parts, but when I could create that feeling of, I would call it my 3D apex in space, it's a slight drift, but it's also a slight coil, and it's really finding that tension. If I could find that position every time for me, which was a unique position for me versus what Marsilli's position might look like, then I would just let the rest of the throw unfold. No thinking about the glove arm, no thinking about the throwing arm, no thinking about the front leg. It was literally just finding that peak load, and the rest of it was just unloading. So it's like you wind up that ball of yarn, then you just let it unwind, or you load the spring, let it unload, but there's no mental energy being expended towards like, what is my glove arm doing? What is my lead leg doing? What is my block doing?
Feel totally the same way, that if I can build the right tension here and hold on to it as long as I can, when I unload it, like now the rest of my body, all the glove, the arm, all the upper body mechanics are just transferring energy to my targets. Like there is, like you said, there's no thought, there's really no like conscious movement there. It's just, how do I get from, I use this like point A to point B terminology with a lot of guys, with how do I get to my point A loaded position and get to my point B release position like as directly as possible. All the, the nuance there is going to kind of happen no matter what.
And I think the reason, like, when you do load and you can't think about when you go, like you talked about, like one of the moves in that beginning move is a move going forward. When you go forward, you allow gravity to catch you, and you're moving faster with a tempo down the mound. When you're moving faster, think, i.e. pull downs, those are normally your hardest, throws that you can make because you have momentum going with you. You can't think. You're just kind of going and transferring energy. I think that's like the same thing with here, which is why that first move is so important to where, yes, we have to get here. Yes, we have to get here. But if there is no here, then we have to think, and we don't have that time element to just let gravity catch us and transfer energy like you talked about. When we can do less thinking and just move organically and let gravity catch us, I mean, those are your best. I think those are your best throws.
So creating tension, but also speeding up, keeping the tempo as quick as you can. I would say control. Like there's such a thing as too fast a tempo.
Absolutely.
Like if you're just here, but as fast a tempo as you can control while creating tension, and then letting the rest of the throw just athletically unfold as it normally would.
I think so. So I think tempo is so underrated, especially with everything, just because the less that you can do thinking up here and just let stuff naturally happen, you're probably going to find out what's the best move for you.
And I think that's something that really resonates with me, just about, I'm kind of allowing myself to think like on the way up, so to speak.
But you also talked about your 1-2, and your 1-2 is pretty fast. Like you gotta have some pretty good tempo if you're going.
Right. And I think for me, in my mind, I'm thinking slow, but the move is simple enough that it has to be fast, so to speak. It has to be quick, on the stopwatch. But that feeling of like catching it on the way down, and everything has to go. And some people I think feel that like with an impulse kind of thing into their back foot. And for me, that that's like a hand rhythm kind of thing, with like a little glove tap there that I'm trying to, float. And when I can't hold it anymore, like everything just has to unlock and go and transfer energy. And, like you said, that's the athletic side of it, I think, coming out.
I mean, I love the impulse for ER guys just because, ER guys, I think sometimes like you have to hold vertical chin and you have to sit back. Well, that's a really slow move if you think about it. Whereas like you think of guys like Verlander, like Vanderbilt, Carson Fulmer, they're very tall until peak leg lift, and then all of a sudden it's boom, and they're just dropping and going. That impulse, I think, is what is creating that little bit of tension for them. You think about like hops, like that impulse is creating that tension for ER guys without having to be slow thinking and just going from there. I think an impulse is a great way to train it for those ER guys. Now, it's not going to work for everyone, but I think for a lot of the population where they favor the ER bias, I think it's an athletic and a pretty good move for them to try and conquer.
So here's a question: When do we use active coaching foot position, coaching certain degrees of hooking the rubber, not hooking the rubber, toe out? When do we use the active coaching versus just trying to let them figure it out with some like drill that gives them that impulse, like a hop back or a step back or the Kikuchi drill, or even like a leg lift crow hop, something where like they have to find that impulse and speed up the tempo and just figure it out on their own, versus kind of unpack things a little bit, regress it, and actively kind of coach them through like how to find tension, like literally square one. Do we try like the athletic stuff first, and if they just can't figure it out, then we regress them, or do we always try to coach them up on their back leg tension no matter what?
I mean, I think it's so case dependent. Like you could have a super athletic guy who, I mean, knows kind of what he's doing, but he's one little cue away. Are you just gonna have him keep doing athletic stuff, or are you gonna be like, hey, just do this? And it could be a simple regress drill, and all of a sudden that's a light bulb moment. Or you take an unathletic person and have him do athletic stuff, and that's his light bulb moment. That's where I think coaching multiple people and like trying to figure it out by case basis is so important.
And for me, I really like to start with the athletic stuff and just like get some sort of baseline idea for like where does this guy kind of naturally bias, or what does his body naturally get into when he wants to produce power. So like I love doing med ball work with guys early, doing other sort of like rotational work with guys, whether that's Kaiser or even just like taking daddy hacks off the tee or whatever. I want to see you rotate with power, and your body is going to find its kind of best position there when you don't consciously do anything with it. I'm looking at the video, I'm trying to see, hey, are these numbers where we want them to be? Like, is this guy actually producing enough force out of this position? If he is, then it's like, okay, maybe the throw should look a little bit more like one of those. And, maybe that dictates like hey, when you get into your 4-pound med ball shot put, you look like this. And you rip that, that med ball, but when you're pitching, you're trying to do this. Why don't we try something different? Whether it's a positional change, like starting, hooking the rubber, something, or just a cue or some sort of other constraint to like force them into that position. I think that's kind of my typical progression there of like seeing what their body wants to do and then trying to like work off of that as much as possible.
So being able to, well, one, just observe them in any sort of general rotational context. So whether it's medicine ball throws with a radar gun, whether it's, just taking absolute, mammoth hack swings off a tee and seeing like how they load. Are they loading more into IR like Bryce Harper? Are they maybe a little bit more like Mike Trout where don't have the IR, so it looks like more of a vertical shin. Seeing how they load in that context. And then have you split tested that too? Like, will you have guys do, maybe it's a Kaiser medicine ball, hey, try toe in, and hey, try toe out, hey, try foot even, hey, no, let's hook the rubber, or like some equivalent of that, put a plate and have their foot hooked, and just see what the power numbers are, see what the medicine ball velos are, see what the tee exit velos are.
Absolutely.
Have you done any like split testing like that?
Once we, at least in, kind of in my experience with myself, but also, guys that I coach, I'm trying to get that basic idea first of like, hey, does this guy, what's his anatomy like? Does he have the capability to get into one position or another? What is his kind of natural bias? And then from there, what do the numbers look like? Because once we kind of get that general idea of where he best produces power, okay, now like a small adjustment might make a 2 mile an hour, 3 mile an hour difference. Like, okay, now it's about the result more than the tiny details. I can figure out how to change my foot position. I just got to practice it enough times, right? So now I'm going to let the radar gun tell me what's best, really.
So starting general, then we can get specific, and we can have more like refined interventions depending on how much we really need to modify this guy's throw. Matt, what would you say for someone who like doesn't even know where to start? They're like, I don't even know what this hip tension thing is. Like in concept, I know, but I've never even felt this like coil, this tension that you guys were talking about. Like, I know you have some PVC pipe stuff that you'll do.
Yeah.
You want to grab that. But is there a way that you cue this for guys who've never even felt this? Like maybe a high school kid who's like, I don't even know what you're saying right now.
I mean, I would say for me is, this is a very regressed drill to where, I'm just like fine-tuned, find that perfect angle. But for me, what I found with a bunch of guys is if they can't create tension or activation into anything that they're doing right here while just holding a stick, how are they going to do it when they're moving fast? So, I mean, like for, some guys to where I'm going to say, hey, we're still moving forward into peak leg lift, but when you drop, like one, you better have tension and you better be able to hold it and get into that position. And what does that look like for those guys? Like for some guys, like someone like Scott or you, Ben, like you're probably gonna turn a little bit, a lot more than me, to where the glute's really activated, and then you're gonna drive in with that shin angle, like you talked about. For someone like me, I'm gonna stay a little bit taller. I'm gonna try and turn into peak leg lift, make sure this is turned on, that I can feel it, and then I'm just trying to hold that position while I'm going down the mount. I really do think like if you can get this move, this first move to where tension into peak leg lift and start dropping in the right position. I mean, we talk about the loading to unload. You get that first loading move right, how can you possibly get it wrong somewhere down the throw?
Yeah. So go to that peak leg lift position and drop into it again, hold it for a second. So right there, what are you feeling in the back hip?
I mean, I'm trying to hold the tension that I've created into peak leg lift right here. When I drop down, I'm trying to hold that position. I'm trying to be able to hold that position for as long as I can. Not position, but tension, activation.
Does that tension literally feel like the outside of your hip is like you can feel all those fibers, your glute, like there's a stretch?
I'm feeling my muscles turned on.
Turned on.
I am actively feeling them turn on to where I am like turning my leg. I have this turned on. I possibly can't do it anymore. Now I'm just dropping and going too.
Gotcha.
I think one thing too, like one thing that gets a bad rep in like vertical shin, like ER guys, is the butt sitting behind you. Like, oh, like you have to sit back with like this vertical shin. I do think like no matter what your hip anatomy is, there has to be some move to where the butt does stay behind you throughout the entire throw. It just simply has to where it doesn't have to be the entire throw. Like we talked about, if you're going slightly cross body, like it's gonna be a slight move here and then you're gonna come. But the first move has to be a move to where it tracks back and behind you. So you can actually hold that down the mound, and it just does so many things to where it puts you into flexion, turns on the muscles that help rotate the hip, helps you do a lot of things to get into foot strike compared to, oh, if I'm going like this, okay, like this move is not right. There is no tension. This is our wrong position. You can hammer this first move for days right there.
Gotcha.
Mind if I just try this
Yeah.
kind of stick idea here?
I think it just allows you for like to explore different
Yeah,
positions too.
like that's kind of like my spot right there.
So what would the distinction be between this and like a Hershiser drill, where like we did? I remember doing this in college, but for me it didn't really help because you would just get up into a position on a wall, and then like when you went back to your catch play, you're like, I have no idea how to get into that position or out of that position, but like I can put myself into a wall and like find that powerful feeling. How do you get in and out of that position?
And we keep using this term tension, but you know, in a Hershiser drill, you're losing connection to the ground.
Yeah.
Like that's where the tension. You don't have tension in a Hershiser drill because you're, you know, just like
You're just shooting forward.
yeah, right. And you start to lose, you know, the weight of your body comes off of that back leg, and now there's nothing happening here. It's dead, you know, dead weight behind you. That tension idea again starts with a fixed point in the ground here. So like something like this makes a lot more sense to me, where I'm actually having to kind of push into the stick here to keep my balance in this position, right? That, you know, my foot is driving into the ground there still, right? I have all of my weight over that. And I think that's where some guys kind of lose this technique a little bit. Like even if they find a good loaded position, they start coming away from it. And now when they actually like want to go and turn, this leg has lost.
Right. And that's the triple extension or just early extension idea, where maybe you find it for a second, but then you just come out of it versus finding it and actually being able to ride it down the mound and rotate out of it. You find it, but then you extend early out of it.
And one thing too is like people have definitely been told like, hey, sit deeper to throw harder. You're gonna load your leg more. Well, this like I think this is like just one of the best ways to actually see like, all right, what depth do I actually feel the most tension, most powerful, but most like in control to where I can rotate
like I can't
out of it.
I know that I can't be that low.
And if you got any deeper than that, now where would you get that from? You're going to get that from like knee flexion. You're going to get that from more somewhere else.
And if I'm up here, like
there's no coil or tension there.
Yeah, I just like I feel my hip turned on here, like my glute turned on, but I don't feel the rotational tension to unwind.
Yeah.
Like I would need to take my leg way back here to find that at this height.
Right.
But
There's some optimal combination of sit,
yes.
coil, and forward move, and that's the 3D winding of tension
Yes.
that we're all kind of mentioning.
That's
Yeah.
why it's just like controlled like expiration right here. I think is like a great first step for me that I do with guys to where really don't know what they're doing in their back leg. Like they're gonna figure it out. Like they're
Right.
gonna be athletic enough to like, all right, like I'm creating tension in this position right here. Okay, I finally found it. What do I do next? Scott talked about like med-ball drills. I think that's a great next step. Step after that, plyo drills, and then throwing, and then on the mound. Like I think there's just an easy like line of progression there that guys can follow if they're really, really trying to like clean up one piece of the delivery.
And what I like about that, or even like the TRX drift drill, is you can, because you're supporting yourself, you can almost move through your leg lift and then into the position and feel out like not only how to get in and out of the position, but it's not like a static.
No.
You can do a static hold there, but like you learn how to get in and out of the position with the leg lift.
And Lance talks about riding the slope the entire time. Like you can actually like work on riding and going down and out at the same time, compared to like getting stuck or going forward. Like it just hammers everything for me. And I think it's an easy first one.
And I think that's just an interesting concept to me about like, you know, matching the slope. Like we've heard that, I think, you know, thrown around at times before, and you know, Lance definitely comments on it a lot. But to me, the feeling that I have to create is a lot more straight down, so to speak. That like if I try to actually actively match that there, I'm gonna lose it. And you know, I think this could be a stylistic thing or a drift, you know, first move thing. Like if you get some momentum going here, like just at the top of my leg lift, I'm just falling a little bit, right? I'm not necessarily like forcing myself out, but if I can just get that little bit of fall going, I'm moving forward. no
You
matter
only
what.
need to think down from
1000%.
there.
I only need to
Bauer
think
talks
down.
about that too. Like
One-
if you
1000%.
already drift out here,
Yes.
then you sit down, that resulting force vector is
Yes.
your forward force vector.
And to me, almost sometimes it's almost like sitting down and back. Like I'm trying to, you know, I need to press into this further as I'm coming down here. If I just like, even if I just thought straight down, like that kind of looks like that to me,
Right.
or feels like that, I almost need to, I'm thinking like, keep winding, keep winding, keep winding, right? Instead of like hit it early, I think that causes me to unwind too early at least. So I'm trying to go like 75% of the way, tension-wise, like on the way up, and then from 75 to 100 by the time I get here. Now, you know, like you said, you hit that max tension, it's gonna unwind. You can't stop it from
Right.
unwinding, right? So now it's just that kind of impulse, and it's got to unlock and go, and I can
100%.
channel that a lot better, I think.
One of the very like introductory things I'll do, I like that. I haven't used that with my guys, but if they just have no idea even where to start, I'll have them almost do like a chopping pattern, like they're doing
Yeah.
kind of like trunk twists.
Yep.
But
Crossbody.
it's
Yeah.
from
I mean,
here, it's like, okay, unwind fully. Now wind up, foot stable on the ground, wind, 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 wind. And at some point, you're gonna run out of room there. It's almost like you're taking a golf hack or something.
Yep.
That's the tension. Like as long as you keep that foot on the ground, you don't let it bow out like this. Keep that foot fixed, wind into it, keep your eyes on the target. There's your tension feeling. And now it's like, okay, how do I create that same feeling of tension as I move forward? One of the very introductory like throwing cues that I'll use if we're doing a lasso drill or a rocker drill is I'll literally have them try to find that tension as they walk their way out. So find that tension. Okay, now walk your way out, walk your way out, walk your way out, walk your way out. Get to the point where you can't find it anymore.
Look, and I think this is just a really interesting thing that people would, I think, benefit from, like how small your steps were there.
Right.
I see so many people go,
Like if I were to just go like here, there's no tension anymore.
yeah,
Like for me, and granted, part of it is like I have poor IR now, and like
starting narrow, so to speak, and just
Right.
like barely kind of working down and out, like
But what I'll tell guys is
Each at
like
a time.
once you find that tension, like hold, don't lose it, stay closed, stay sideways, don't lose it, don't lose it, don't lose it, don't lose it. For me, like that's my max right now. Now with a healthy hip, like yeah, my shin angle would be a little bit more there. I'd be able to get another 6 inches further down. Maybe Chase Petty's like down here because he's got more room. Maybe Marsilli's like 6 inches shorter because he doesn't have as much room. But it's finding that tension. And so if we're gonna just do like a lasso drill, I'd rather you get to that position of tension first, load, unload, and do your drill. If we're gonna do a rocker drill instead of just rock, rock, throw, or figure eight, throw, I'd rather you find the tension first and then go through the drill, find the tension, so you have something to unload, versus just guys just get in the position. They're like, I'm supposed to be at my landing position for this drill. Well, what's the point if you're not actually loading into your lower half? So even if it's an upper half drill, a rocker drill, like I still view it as that is a lower half drill. That's an opportunity to load and unload your backside.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I definitely think about it the same way. And like, you know, I think there are cases maybe where, you know, top can influence bottom, so to speak, but for the most part, like this is a one direction flow. It's back foot, you know, to throwing arm, bottom to top. So like you said, everything's a lower half drill, right? Like if you're not figuring that out, right, the transition between, you know, lower unload,
Everything's ground
and
up.
upper unload, like, yeah, what's the point? And I think a lot of people miss that just in, you know, their static drills or, you know, arm action drills, right? It's easy to go totally upper half centric, but if you miss the connection to the lower half, there's going to be probably an issue with the upper half that like now we keep chasing that and trying to solve that when really we might just solve the lower half and erase the upper body issue completely.
Yeah, 1,000%. I mean, you think like a 10 toes, like everyone just thinks, oh, 10 toes, I'm just gonna stay here and throw.
Yeah.
Like how are we not like turning, loading, and then using this to get everything going?
Mm-hmm.
You can even do it from the knees too, to where like you're on your knees, but like your first move is gonna be to get this going.
Yep.
Same with the pivot picks. Like you're starting here, first move is boom, like there. Like everything is so ground up, and people just lose.
I love what you said there about like that move triggers the throw to me, right? Like being able to have that at least little bit of tension and turn and put the other foot down, like that's always going to trigger everything else on the top half.
Yeah. I think that's one of the hidden benefits of occasionally adding some like radar feedback to upper half drills is, you know, if you just go ahead and just like do an arm action drill, like yeah, maybe you're feeling something, maybe it's helpful, but maybe you're throwing 60 miles an hour out of it, and you know, the guys we have that do test those occasionally, like that are throwing 85 miles an hour from literally this position right here, like you're not going to do that just arm action only. But if you can really unload from there, like that's where you can really learn how to use that. Now it's not the exact same position as you're going to get on the mound, but it starts to teach you like what is that loading and unloading, what does that like tornado of energy feel like?
Yeah.
And it's not this.
That was a huge unlock for me. I mean, last year, the first time I did 10 toes, I was just right here and just ripped it. And it was like,
that's the definition of tornado in a doorway or you know whatever, right? Like
first time thinking no lower half, like 75, like oh that's good. And I remember Devin was like, dude, just like load your back leg, and I was like, oh all right. Like I'm like, what do you mean?
Never
He's like,
thought of that in
it's like just
toes
like
before.
I was like just like get a little bit turn, like feel the glute turn on, and all of a sudden it was like 82, 83, and I was like, oh that's what it's supposed to feel like. And it's like yeah, like it's never just that ever.
Right, but you can take that 10 toes feeling of just like tornado going straight up.
Oh yeah.
Right, and now I just like shift my feet here, right? So I'm giving myself that like I'm still doing a 10 toes basically. I'm just going, you know, like directionally slightly more. Now I'm going to like a rocker.
Yeah.
Right. Now I'm going to a rocker hover. Right. Now I'm going to a full delivery. Like
just add little pieces.
They just build one after another that like if you can follow that linkage between each drill, you're going to build it back to the full delivery at some point.
And you can find out where does it actually break down.
Mm-hmm.
And then like that's nice knowing like, all right, we're going to target this, back it up a little bit, and then once you fix it, start pushing to the next piece.
Yeah.
So this kind of ties back into there's a there's a misconception, I guess you could say hitting and pitching, like squish the bug idea, but the idea of like the rotation is starting from the ground up. So some people interpret that as like, well, what really is happening is this back knee is just slamming down, and like this is what kickstarts the entire chain of events, and it's somehow like the femur internally rotating triggers the pelvis, triggers everything. Can we dispel that myth?
Yeah.
As like it's so obvious
Myth
to
busted.
someone who's thrown hard, it's so not obvious to someone who is studying it from a textbook or
Right.
from a research lab who hasn't thrown hard. Can we like dispel what's going on there, and why? How can you show for sure that it's not? This is what starts the action, and it's really winding the tension
So,
and pelvis unloading.
the tornado, idea, right? These are all rotational movements, right? They're rotational sequences all the way up the chain. If you go linear at the very beginning, you're about to go linear for a lot of the rest of it too. You have to start the sequence with a rotational move, right? And I'm, kind of exemplifying this by doing like a squish the bug type thing. But this goes back to our earlier point about, okay, if I want my leg to rotate here instead of push, okay, well, I need to hit maximum rotational tension where it is forced to unwind, forced to rebound, right? And that's all in the loading pattern.
Right.
If I load linear, quad, right, slam the knee down, like that sequence all follows, perfect logic to me. If I load rotational, corkscrew my foot into the ground or into the rubber, turning, spiral load up the leg, right? If I load it that way, it's going to unload that way. And I know I want that to be how I unload it, so I have to force myself to learn how to load it the right way.
Yeah, and it's that idea, like everything you're demoing there is like very like proximal pelvis, center of the body, like you're showing the load and unload, and you're, without even realizing it, like you're showing that from the center of your body right here.
Yep.
The problem with trying to trigger the unloading from like slamming the knee down is like
Too distal.
the femur is not the driver of rotational power in your body. This is the spinal engine concept. It's the pelvic spine complex. No matter how hard I do this, there's no
action in the
like
pelvis.
desire for my pelvis to rotate. Whereas like if I do this, there's every desire for this femur to come along with it. If I create tension and unload violently from my pelvis, it pulls this with it. But if I just slam this as hard as I want, my pelvis does not want to do anything. I'm literally it's an isolated movement.
Yes.
There's no connection from that to the pelvis. But if you wind it into one, almost like, now this is like one big
Unit.
yeah. And now you can unload it from the pelvis. It brings this entire chain that's now connected along together. And now that's how you spiral everything up the chain.
Yeah, and I see, because we've developed, a better understanding of mechanics from the sense of like we can watch people more clearly and describe like exactly what they're doing or what their body is doing. So we see ankle eversion, and like so many people who are training and trying to throw better, they're like, oh, I just need to like try to evert, and then like that'll be the unlock for me. And it's like, again, you mentioned the knee, but like too distal, right? That's not the thing that's triggering rotational power. You need to have the right anchor system here, but yeah, the rest of it, and I love that you said that because, hips and shoulders, the middle is gonna control this movement. If I just turn my belt buckle, or turn my pelvis to load, like I kind of get into the position that I want naturally. My front leg lifts naturally. Like that's not a conscious move for me to really take my foot, there to there. That's just like turning the hips, turning the body, like naturally picks that up, into a leg lift. So moving from the center, I think, is a pretty big concept there that people could.
Awesome. And last thing I wanted to just kind of touch on, Matt, you mentioned it briefly at the beginning, how, there is a bony block at some point. You're not going to necessarily be able to unlock 25 degrees of internal rotation. Like if your hips are naturally like that's your IR, like you're not going to ever end up like with that much IR. Like you're just not. So maybe you get 5 degrees. Maybe there's a point where you push too much, you just tearing up your labrum and running into that bony block. So where exactly are you going to steal? Are you trying to steal range of motion from elsewhere? Are you just trying to work with what you got? Touch on what you've done for the adductors, the ankle.
I mean, so for me, like I remember, first getting down here and like, all right, need to open up hip IR. Have no hip IR. Let's just do a bunch of hip high IR correctives. And I just remember sitting there like, I feel nothing. If anything, like I just feel like uncomfortable. Like this just isn't working. So like going back and looking at, all right, like what also is playing a factor in unwinding the leg into foot strike. One was my ankles and just adding eversion, having the range of motion of my foot to go from inversion to eversion and just start that unload of the leg coming down like this. Next was the tibia, like making sure the tibia can load to unload. So I didn't have much range of motion in my tibia either. So being able to get my tibia to where I can actually internally rotate and to get that to start to rotate, that was a great first move for me to actually get my hip to start to rotate. And then from there, like the muscles that help internally rotate the back hip, the biggest one being the adductor was, yes, is this actually gonna help me open up more range of motion and hip IR? No, I have a bony block in there. But it was actually helping me to actually lengthen, create a little bit more room from somewhere else that helped me just unload it a little bit easierly.
You could still hold it down you could hold it into your stride a hair longer.
Absolutely.
By opening up the adductor, you could stay in it instead of to here. You could stay in it a little bit longer.
I mean, you talk about like just a like undervalued like muscle throughout the delivery, like being able to apply force in the ground for a long time, like that is coming from your adductors and being able to stay in that sideways tension position and then boom, you're unloading. If you can only do it right here, like there's just you're losing out on energy and force that you can put into the ground. So for me, it's just, there was no working on actually opening up my hip, but addressing the other things that help my leg unload. Ankle, tibia, adductor, muscles like glute min, glute max, TFL, like all that was just so important.
Right. So pretty much just like, can you squeeze out little bits of toothpaste from that toothpaste tube, like anywhere you can? Can we get that eversion to be a little bit cleaner? Can we squeeze out a few degrees of tibial IR? Can we improve the tissue quality 10%, 20% in your adductors to where you can get a few inches deeper into the stride? More
times than not, if you're trying to, wherever desired motion you are, like if you're trying to get more layback or more IR, like there's more pieces that actually go into it than just, oh, I'm just gonna externally rotate my shoulder. Oh, I'm just gonna internally rotate my hip. Like, no, there's a lot of factors that are going to influence that to where if you actually can't do it from like the actual motion you're trying to get, try and find, like you said, squeeze out the toothpaste in other areas that are gonna help you with the desired motion that you're looking for.
I mean, if you can get, a 5% better position, what does that translate to performance-wise? Like, probably at least 5%, at least some small gain for sure.
And you're talking about trying to go from like 95 and trying to squeeze out every mile an hour, like
exactly.
You better be like spot on with everything.
And the difference between sitting 92, not having a job in professional baseball, and sitting 94, 95, there's big league starters that do that and make tens of millions of dollars. So like I think every little bit does matter. And I think that's the takeaway point is like we're just giving a bunch of ideas from cueing, from different drill ideas, from mobility side of things. There's not going to be necessarily one right answer, but just going over some of the general principles that really do apply to every hard thrower.
And I think it's, we've all experienced it in kind of unique individual ways, but, those small changes or details have all meant, 2 to 4 miles an hour for all of us. Like, -4 when I try here, and then +4 when I go here. Like, that's no accident, but sometimes it's, getting to that solution is not as obvious as it seems. So like having some understanding of the concept, and which I think is still evolving for all of us anyways, but having some understanding of what you're trying to do will lead to a better possibility of you actually executing the right move like when you want to. So having some options to try different things, practice in different ways, Like that made a big difference for me for sure. So.
And then I guess one final question is, let's say you have a guy he's throwing pretty well, it looks great on video, or it looks great in person, and you think he's getting tension, but you're not quite sure. Or it looks like he's vertical shin, but you're not quite sure if he's getting there here or if he's getting there. Can you always tell visually that they're creating tension, or do you have to have that dialogue with the athlete and know what they're feeling, because it can look so similar on video?
I think you need to always have the dialogue with the athlete, really. I mean, no matter what it looks like on film, it just doesn't tell the whole story. And especially like film with no radar, I mean, even less of a story, right? So, I have kind of an expectation level of like where I'm expecting this guy to be, what I'm expecting him to look like, what I'm expecting the velocity to be. And obviously if it's different than that, I'm saying, okay, what's going on here? Why does this look so good, but the result isn't good? And that does happen sometimes. And I'm sure it's happened to all of us too. So being able to work through that and talking through it with somebody that you actually trust their opinion on it, that's made a huge difference. And I know, having the opportunity to talk with you guys and talk with different coaches here, that helped me to understand this concept the way that I do now, where I would have still been doing, the same thing.
Spread the floor.
Yeah, because that was my understanding of it. That was my simplistic understanding of it. But working with more guys, talking with more people, bouncing ideas around like this, kind of led to the evolution of my understanding, and therefore, how we can bring that to other people as well.
It's also the feel versus real too. What is someone feeling versus what's actually going on, and then being able to remember every single person is different. Even if 1 + 1 is supposed to equal 2, it doesn't always do that. So being able to add stuff in that you probably wouldn't think would be right may be right for someone. That's just where having the multiple case studies, having the conversations, and being able to know what certain people feel, what they don't feel, what they do. That's where I think being a really good coach comes from. It's just being able to, when it doesn't add up, where do you substitute and put stuff in?
And the athlete, that conversation is going to probably give you some valuable information there. If you ask them what they're feeling, I just feel I just feel like I'm sitting. Feels really comfortable, feels really easy.
Right.
It's okay, well, hey, it looks fine, but if that's what you're feeling, then I know that it's not quite right. So talking to them is probably the most important part of all of this, after you've kind of figured out a baseline of what you think.
It's the most subjective piece of it, but it's also one of the most important pieces that
Exactly.
a coach understands, but maybe someone just doing research wouldn't understand that subjective piece, because it's hard to quantify. Sure. But the feel is almost the language of that's their internal language. The data, the mocaps, that has to then be translated into the feel of their body. That's the language of their body. But if they're just straight up telling you the feel, they're giving you a straight, unfiltered
That's what
look
it is.
into
Capturing
the language
capturing
of their
that
body.
moment in time and being able to revert back to that, I think is that's the biggest thing.
And writing that
writing it down.
Yeah, writing down what am I feeling.
Yep.
Right, that's a big thing, because we're talking about, it can look different than it feels. And on video or mocap or whatever, when we're looking at mechanics, it's just a description of what's happening. Right? Does DeGrom really feel, the way that he exactly looks when he's throwing hard? You'd have to ask him.
Right.
Right. And
But
I
the
think
feel
that's
is arguably, from his standpoint, probably more important, because that's
Exactly.
the treasure map that gets him to the outcome.
Exactly.
That's what he needs to be thinking,
feeling.
yeah.
The feel produces
to
the
get to
visual.
that outcome.
Yeah, but I think, and that's the point that I'm kind of getting at, that has kind of blown my mind over the last couple months, that it's all about the feel. You have to create the right feel, and that'll make the visual be the right thing. But sometimes I think we chase the visual and we miss the feel. And that, I've been guilty of that for sure, but what a kind of a transformative thought for me, honestly.